The 2023 Beautiful England calendar features 12 locations across England, which we have challenged ourselves to travel to on our motorbikes as much as we can during the month that they feature. Keeping with the investigation theme from the last video, our destination for November seemed like it would be a bit tricky to pin down if we wanted to replicate the calendar photo. Here is the image in the calendar, and the caption simply reads, "Narrowboats on the Kennet and Avon Canal." The Kennet and Avon Canal is 87 miles long and runs from Bristol to Reading. Needless to say, this isn't very specific. We first tried to find the original photo used in the calendar in the hopes that this might lead us to some sort of location, but we had no luck. Eventually we settled on instead visiting the Cairn.
In English, this is often said as Cairn
Hill locks, which frankly would have made for a more suitable photo for this particular calendar rather than a random bit of towpath. While we agreed that we would visit Cairn Hill, and I'm sticking with that pronunciation so feel free to leave me some angry comments if it's wrong, we did feel a little bit sore about not being able to visit one of the locations from the calendar. So we took to the internet for help, with Frey making inquiries with a Kennet and Avon Canal Facebook group, while I took to the Where Was This Taken subreddit. Frey immediately got a fair few responses, with the majority suggesting that it was taken near the Tithe Barn in Bradford-on-Avon. A fair bit of the canals in England are on Google Street View, so we had a look for ourselves and weren't convinced. With the photo being fairly generic and the most unique aspects being boats that move and a temporary fence, it was difficult to say whether or not they were right. A post from Reddit user It's Bees seemed to back up these claims though. Not only had they found a larger and filtered version of the calendar picture, they'd also provided a Street View link to what they believed to be the spot where the photo was taken from, clarifying that the photo was likely zoomed in from a further spot. After noticing similar trees on the edge of the towpath, we were now convinced and set our sights on Bradford-on-Avon, with plans to also visit the Cairn Hill locks because they're only about a 20-minute ride away from there. The other issue to consider was the weather. With it being firmly November, and a rather chilly one at that, we dug out our extra layers to try and keep the wind out as much as possible. The only day we definitely had available for this trip in November was the 11th, which mercifully was one of the few days being forecast as having no rain, though we hoped our extra layers would also hinder any moisture that might decide to make an appearance. For the most part, we did manage to stay fairly warm. Or rather, we didn't get too cold, though this has reinforced my decision to pick up some new gloves when we visit Motorcycle Live at the end of the month. Our destination being at the very bottom end of the Cotswolds created a bit of a snag when it came to route planning. We'd been through the Cotswolds several times throughout this year, particularly the A429 through Stow-on-the-Wold to Cirencester, and we were keen to avoid it if possible. Sure, there are plenty of routes we could take which we haven't yet experienced, but we had to make this trip in one day rather than staying overnight, and I was eager to avoid riding at night as much as possible due to my hilariously crap headlight, which is an issue when the sun sets before 5 PM. So we settled on a compromise. We would aim to leave at 7:30 AM, 10 minutes after the sun officially rises, and take the A46 down to the M5 and the M4 until we get back on the A46 and into Bradford. From there it's about 20 or 30 minute ride over to Cairn Hill near Devizes, and from there we can swing around and up onto the A419 around Swindon into Cirencester and then back home along the bloody A429, hopefully missing all the tourist traffic in Stow-on-the-Wold and Morton in the Marsh, getting back home before it gets too dark. Easy. While we did miss our target departure of 7:30 AM, we were on the road by 8, being blinded by the autumnal sun. Having learned our lessons from the trips in the earlier months of the year, we were keeping a comfortable temperature, even after getting up to speed on the M69. While we had both used the A46 down towards Stratford before, we noted that this was likely the first time we had done so outside of rush hour, meaning what we had only previously experienced as a giant queue linking the M40 to the M5 was actually a very enjoyable bit of road, particularly the newer dual lane roads around Evesham, though these are balanced out by an abundance of roundabouts. Our first planned stop was Michaelwood services on the M5 to get fuel, which is about a 2-hour ride away from home. We normally allow ourselves to have a bit of a break every hour or so, but a combination of the quieter roads, good weather and comfortable temperature kept us going without stopping. I said in the last video that we find the M5 to be one of the most boring motorways in the UK, due in part to the state of the service stations. Michael would seem to reinforce this statement, as the men's toilets were a confusing maze of tight corridors, the car park is full of construction barriers restricting vision at junctions, and there's a mild obstacle course of dog shit around the main entrance. Lovely. Still feeling energised though, and with about an hour to go until we got to Bradford, we filled up and carried on to the M4, where we bumped into a chap out for a ride on what we think is an older Triumph Rocket, the newer version of which I'm hoping to have a test ride on at Motorcycle Live this year. We left the M4 at junction 18 to rejoin the A46. We said goodbye to our Triumph friend at a petrol station in Pennsylvania and continued along another enjoyable stretch of road, surrounded by scenery that reminded us of imagery you might find on a packet of butter. Bit of a warning for this road though, as on the approach to Bath it opens out into a 2-lane carriageway, which is great when you've been stuck behind a slow driver. What isn't great is that just after the road opens up, they've stuck a speed camera on the bend. Now obviously we weren't speeding and were both nervously anticipating an unrelated fine to drop through our letterbox in the near future. While discussing how other, less observant riders might be caught out by such a malicious camera placement, we left the A46 for the A363, a wonderfully twisty road that follows the River Avon into Bradford itself. We'd come through Bradford before on the way back from a week in Cornwall back in 2019, but we would be going down the steep hill this time rather than climbing up it, though that descent proved to be more of a waddle due to the heavy traffic. Bradford is one of those towns which can feel like it's frozen in time, mainly due to the age of the buildings and the lack of big brand chain stores. But it's also due to the tiny ancient roads that are completely unsuitable for modern traffic levels. Still, it's one of those places that is perfect to have a wander around in on a sunny day, but we cut through the middle of town and out to the Tithe Barn, where we parked it for free along the side of Pound Lane next to the park. I wouldn't count on this space being available if you're in a car, but there is a pay-and display closer to the Tithe Barn if you can't find a free spot. We fairly quickly found our specific destination at the end of the footpath that cuts through the park. However, there were some huge boats moored up that meant we couldn't quite line the picture up as much as we'd liked. Still, going off the trees on the right, we are certain that this is the spot. The original image is incredibly cropped though, and doing the same to our photos left them looking grainy and potatoey, so we left it at full resolution. Anyway, after exploring the barn and taking note of the high water levels in the Avon, we saddled up and out of Bradford, getting stuck behind cars that have no business being that wide, driven by people who are clearly intimidated by said width of their vehicles. We took the B3107 out of Bradford through Holt and into Melksham, where we encountered a little bit of flooding on the road. I'd never had to ford a river before, so I followed the other biker in front of me, sticking to the middle of the road where the tarmac was still visible, until it wasn't. Having recently been watching a video of a motorbike tour of Iceland and mocking someone called Steve for flooding his bike after trying to show off, I remembered the lessons of low gear, constant speed, and made it through safely, though with slightly wet feet. Frey made it through just fine and managed to keep her toe dry too, after having plenty of practice on her Mod 2 test where she had to traverse 3 different flooded roads. With that bit of off-roading conquered, we trundled along the much drier A365 to the A361 and turned off for the Cane Hill Locks. You can catch a quick glimpse of the locks from this bridge, and we would have stopped at the nearby lay-by for a photo if not for the fact that the car park at the top of the hill has a cafe next to it and I really needed a toilet break. In hindsight, this is a daft idea because the access road to the paid car park is half a mile of constant speed bumps and parking tickets are a flat £3. We also ended up walking all the way back down to the bridge anyway, so lesson learned, park at the bottom and see it all for free. That said, the walk from top to bottom, or from car park to bridge, is only about 15 minutes each way, and while it is a bit more difficult while wearing armoured jackets and trousers, it isn't too bad of a stroll. The run between the bridge and the cafe contains 16 locks, and they are known as one of the 7 wonders of the waterways, taking a boat around 5 or 6 hours to get through. The other 6 wonders, as you've asked, are the Pontcossuxter, apparently, aqueduct between Wrexham and Oswestry, the Sandridge Tunnel near Huddersfield, the Barton Swing Aqueduct on the west side of Manchester, the Anderton Boat Lift near Northwich, the Burnley Embankment in, Burnley, and finally the Bingley 5 Rise Locks in Bingley near Bradford, which frankly seems like a charity case when compared to Cane Hill. With it starting to feel like evening was drawing in, despite it being only about 2:30 PM, we headed off towards home along the A432 and A3102, taking us through Royal Wootton Bassett, which didn't feel very royal, and through the Cotswold Water Park. These roads were mostly just the right level of entertaining, with there always being another corner to tackle or another town to pass through. We jumped on the A419 very briefly to take us to the outskirts of Cirencester before we joined the good old A429 to take us through Stow-on-the-Wold and Morton-in-the-Marsh up to the M40 junction. We stopped at the petrol station outside Stow, being one of the few places on our route that has E5 unleaded available, and had a bit of a top-up of caffeine. It was starting to get dark now, and we were still an hour and a half away from home. But it was mostly all larger roads with intermittent lighting from now on, so the lack of natural light shouldn't cause too much of an issue. And indeed it didn't, though we had both accumulated a layer of muck on our helmet visors, which made riding with them down a little less visible than I would have liked, particularly when oncoming headlights tend to blur everything around them. After some experimentation with my headlight, we agreed that it was indeed crap and needs looking at with some priority. Despite all of this, we managed to arrive home safely around 9.5 hours after we left, ready for a bit of a sit by the fire. So that's trip 11 in the bag, done, dusted, and even some extra credit work done too. I still think this photo is the most boring in the calendar though. I mean, it's nice enough, but it's in there with sites like Whitby Abbey and Brighton Pier, so a random bit of canal in Wiltshire seems like an odd choice, especially when the Cane Hill locks are just down the road or the Tithe Barn is right there. Our final destination for 2023 in the cold month of December is Rydal Water in the Lake District, a fantastic area for bikers, but arguably the worst time of year for road conditions. We think we figured out where this photo was taken from, but the trickiest part will likely be the logistics of it all, being that we will hopefully be moving house in December and we'll be out of the country for a couple of weeks. Make sure to subscribe to see that video, and we'll see you next month for our final episode of the year.